So, as you know, I've done a lot of videos about China and US China relations, so a lot of people have asked me, how did Yao Ming get to be president? Like, the Chinese rightfully made fun of us for 4 years for electing a reality show star to our highest office, and then they elected Yao Ming president? And then some people know that it's even weirder than that. No, he wasn't elected, but he is president. I think it's common enough knowledge on the Western internet that even though China is a thriving democracy, Yao Ming was not a candidate in the 2022 Chinese presidential election. He didn't defeat Xi Jinping, but he sure did succeed Xi as president. How? Time to explain the Byzantine process of Chinese democracy. I'm your host, Tor Parsons. These are my co-hosts, Jollibee the Doll and Thimble the Durian, and welcome to a rather different episode of Tor's Cabinet of Curiosities. As you probably know, China democratized after the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre galvanized the public to topple the government. There were a few years when this toad-looking guy, Jiang Zemin, was a transitional caretaker, president, general secretary something. And then in the first ever nationwide election in China, voters approved the Constitution of 1991 in a landslide, followed by the first Chinese election in 1992 in which Liberal Party Chairman Bao Tong, an ex-communist, became the first ever democratically elected president of the world's most populous country. The Constitution of 91 set up a presidential system kind of like the US, with an executive presidency and a unicameral 5,000-seat legislature called the National People's Congress, a name that carries over from the old communist days. The NPC, as it's known, has 2,851 members who represent single-seat constituencies and 2,149 members who represent provincial-level party lists. This is called mixed member proportional representation, and the system is the same as the one used in Germany and New Zealand. The NPC can be controlled by a different party or alliance than the president, which of course creates gridlock, but that's rare because China doesn't have midterm elections. The only two times that happened, it was because of coalition infighting that caused alliances to shift midway through a presidential term, and both times it only lasted less than a year before a new coalition that included the president's party was able to form. NPC and presidential elections happen on the same ballot every 5 years, in years ending with 2 and years ending with 7. I'm gonna do a bad job of this, because, come on, Chinese politics are one of the most complicated subjects in the universe, and I can't pretend to understand it all. I understand it basically on the level of the average Chinese person, but that's still not great. Every elected president of China until now has belonged to either the Liberal Party or the Communist Party. The Western left-right spectrum doesn't really apply in China. First, because the two biggest traditional parties are left-wing in the Western understanding on some issues and right-wing on others. The commies are left-wing on economics, but very traditionalist and nationalist on social issues. The libs are much more pro-business, but also feminist and pro-LGBT in a way the CCP definitely isn't, at least today. But also, obviously, because of China's background, being leftist is considered traditional and quote-unquote conservative, and being pro-capitalist is considered modern and quote-unquote progressive. That's the way the system has been since the Constitution of 91, but the 2022 Chinese election, the 7th general election in Chinese history, was the first one where people started saying something like a second party system might be forming. We're getting to the point where China has been democratic for long enough that people are dissatisfied with how it's going and want new parties. For one thing, it was a three-way election, which hasn't happened before. Three major candidates, one of whom was a previous Liberal Alliance presidential nominee, and that led to an unelected celebrity president. I promise I will explain how that works. Even though China has lots of parties beyond just the CCP and the Liberals, and typically even both major parties combined don't constitute a majority in the NPC, all major parties decide ahead of each election to sort themselves into one of two alliances, backing one of two presidential candidates. The alliances have been pretty unchanged since the late 2000s, but when the NPC adjourns 6 months ahead of an election and the alliance forming period begins, the media always makes a big deal when a minor party announces they're switching from the communist-led alliance to the liberal-led alliance or vice versa, because that's taken as a sign that the alliance they defected from is in trouble in the upcoming election. There have always been a couple tiny minor parties that run their own presidential candidate, but none of them have been nearly as successful as Fan Jianquan's independent run was in 2022. So who's Fan Jianquan? Fan Jianquan is the speaker of the NPC right now under Yao Ming, and he's pretty much the de facto leader of China. Everyone knows Yao is a figurehead. Fan has been described in the media outside China as a populist, and I think that's right. All three candidates in 22, incumbent president and Communist Alliance leader Xi Jinping, businessman and Liberal Alliance leader Jack Ma, and independent former Sichuan governor Fan Jianquan, have been described as populists, but Fan feels like a genuine anti-establishment candidate who's sort of his own thing in China. Fan was originally a real estate magnate in his hometown of Yibin in Sichuan. Like a lot of businessmen in China, he was active in local politics, serving on the Yibin City Council in the 2000s, but that clearly wasn't originally his main job. I've heard him described as a billionaire, and I think that means a billionaire in yuan, not dollars, but that's still a lot of money, like at least $150 million. And I know what you're thinking, real estate billionaire populist, but Fan is definitely a small L liberal, and if anyone in China is a Trumpian right-wing populist demagogue, it's actually Xi Jinping, whose two-term 10-year presidency ended in 2022 when he was crushed by both Fan and Ma. Since then, in a 2024 referendum, China approved a constitutional amendment establishing an official two-term limit. Like in America before FDR, before Xi, a two-term limit was a convention, but not in the Constitution, and nobody had run for a third term until Xi did in 2022. Now nobody will again. Anyway, back to Fan Jianquan. If there's an American politician I'd compare him to, it might be Ross Perot. Fan was radicalized by the 2008 Sichuan earthquake, which devastated his hometown, notably killing hundreds of children in poorly built schools, and he began raging against the Sichuan provincial government, which had been controlled by the communists since the dawn of the democratic era. Well, and before that. Fan assembled his own reformist, anti-corruption, center-populist party, Chuanji, which is impossible to translate but was rendered as everything from Rivers of Change to Opportunity Sichuan to Fan Jianquan's Moment to Sichuan at the Crossroads, which was English fluent Fan's preferred translation. It was meant to be understood as all those meanings and more. Mandarin is fantastic. Chuanji got support from most of the parties in Sichuan that weren't the CCP, and Fan defeated the incumbent governor of Sichuan, Jiang Zhufang, in 2010 in a landslide, immediately chairing a convention for a new provincial constitution that gave Sichuan residents the widest-ranging rights and freedoms in China, and established the first provincial-level term limits, which most provinces have now. Fan was hugely popular for his reforms and the way he, built back better from the earthquake, and in the 2012 presidential election, just 2 years into his governorship, he dark-horsed his way to being the presidential nominee for the Liberal-led alliance. Technically the first major alliance nominee who wasn't a member of the Liberal or Communist parties. They don't really have open presidential primaries in China. Party committees select their candidates, which makes it harder for a reform-minded populist candidate to reach the presidency, but Fan was the first presidential candidate to successfully pursue a strategy where, during the alliance-forming period, he sought the endorsement of all the minor one-issue parties that were tentatively expecting to join the Liberal Alliance, and entered the 2012 Liberal Party convention in Shenzhen with support already locked down from the minor parties, which eventually, to most observers' surprise, gave him enough leverage to be selected as the Liberal Alliance nominee on the 78th ballot. Meanwhile, on the communist side, they nominated Xi Jinping, the NPC party list leader from Shaanxi, who was the son of a major figure in the old regime and was seen at the time as like a safe establishment choice who wouldn't upset the apple cart. To get support from the more hardline members of the alliance, Xi selected Chongqing Mayor Bo Xilai from the True Left, a split-off party from the CCP that's more openly Maoist and anti-revisionist. The Constitution of 91 actually prohibits presidential candidates from selecting a vice president from their same party, which is one of the multiple clauses in the Constitution that are aimed at encouraging the complicated many-party system to coalesce into two big alliances. We'll get to the other important such clause in a bit. Fan selected Liberal leader He Weifang as Veep in a conciliatory gesture to the mainstream leadership of his alliance. Polls were close, and boy oh boy was the election close. Here's where the very weird parts of the Chinese constitution come into play. See, the constitution says that in order to be president, a candidate has to win a majority of the popular vote and a majority of provinces. This was deliberately inspired by the American Electoral College, which I guess felt like a good idea at the time. In 1991, the last American election where the Electoral College winner lost the popular vote was in 1888, so the framers of the Chinese Constitution presumably weren't too worried about the chance of something like that happening. What happens if a candidate doesn't win a majority of the popular vote in provinces? This is the part of the Constitution meant to really encourage coalition building. If no candidate wins a majority, all candidates get punished. None of them are allowed to be president. Before the election, all the presidential candidates, including the minor ones who get under 1% of the vote, need to draw up and unanimously agree on what's called a secret list. A list of 5 people who will, in order, be called on to be president if there's no majority winner. As the name suggests, the candidates on the secret list aren't publicly revealed until after the election, so that people who like the candidates on the secret list don't vote with the intention of tying up the election. The people on the secret list are informed before the election that they're on the list, but aren't allowed to know their position, like if they're first, second, third choice, nor who else is on the list. And here's the real stinger: the secret list candidates cannot be registered members of any party. So the secret list is always a bunch of blandly likable, apolitical celebrities. The number one candidate on the secret list in 2002 and 2007 was Jackie Chan, until he ran for and won a seat in the NPC as a communist in the 2012 election, which wasn't out of any real interest in politics, but just to eliminate the risk of being forced into being president. Yes, the people on the secret list can refuse if called upon, but if there really had been an election that had come down to the secret list, there would be pretty strong pressure on Jackie Chan to accept. The secret list isn't supposed to be a workable political solution. It's meant to discourage elections with lots of candidates by making heavily split elections into a mind-screwing, undemocratic nightmare. The threat of the secret list has kept alliances in line. Until 2022, the only people who ran for president were major alliance candidates who had a real chance of winning a majority, and tiny fringe candidates whose party didn't even have a single seat in the NPC. But in 2012, there were a lot of tiny fringe candidates, notably including Hong Kong independence activist Badiou Liang, who, despite being a teenager at the time, won a plurality in Hong Kong, the only province where he was on the ballot. And they added up. The results of the 2012 presidential election were this: Xi won a majority of provinces, but Fan ever so narrowly won the popular vote, 48.979% to 48.978%. The popular vote difference came down to 600,000 votes nationwide, which is minuscule in a country of 1.5 billion people. It was the first time no candidate had won over 50% of the popular vote. What was going to happen? It seemed at first like the secret list was going to become relevant. The secret list was revealed, and infighting immediately broke out between the 5 people on it: a ping pong star, an actress, a retired military officer, a recycling tycoon, and the former chair of the Bank of China, over who would get to be president, even though that's not how the secret list works, and the banker, Tian Guoli, would have been president since he was number 1 on the list. But it wasn't even clear the secret list would be used at all. The Supreme Court had to weigh in, and they made a deeply controversial decision. Actually, you don't need to win a majority of the popular vote and a majority of provinces to be president. You need to win a majority of the popular vote or a majority of provinces. And Xi had won a majority of provinces, so he became president. So basically, the 2012 election in China was America's 2000 election, but worse. A liberal member of the NPC asked Fan after the defeat, "How are we going to fight this illegal power grab?" And he famously responded, "By governing well." And he did. He was still governor of Sichuan, so he kept governing there. He cracked down on housing speculation, which to this day makes Sichuan one of China's most affordable provinces to live in. Fan was re-elected governor in 2015 on a promise to legalize gay marriage and recreational marijuana, which he did after the election with a strengthened majority in the provincial legislature, making Sichuan the first polity in East Asia to do either of those things. Fan was famous for going to other provinces to promote Sichuan tourism and even greeting foreign dignitaries wearing a panda suit, which led to ongoing jokes on Chinese social media that he's a furry. Fan declined to run for president again in 2017, despite polls suggesting he'd comfortably beat Xi, and Xi narrowly won a second term, but with a slim popular vote majority this time, against Wang Yang, a liberal who was the long-serving governor of Anhui. Fan was term limited out of office in Sichuan in 2020, right as COVID began to hit, and returned to Yibin for what people expected would be a comfy retirement. It wasn't until the alliance-forming period for the 2022 election was already underway that he made a comeback. The communist-led alliance nominated Xi and Bo for a third term, which made most of China go, "Wait, you can do that?" And the liberal-led alliance nominated the business tycoon Jack Ma, who had no political experience and was a member of the libertarian-minded Capitalist Party. A lot of China said, "We've got to be able to do better than those bozos," and with those words, Fan Jianquan rode in on a white horse. Actually, it was Ma who rode into his rallies on a white horse. Seriously, he did that all the time. It was a pun on his name. His name means horse. Xi's heavy-handed response to COVID and perceived lack of response to China's slowing growth and cost of living issues made him deeply unpopular by 2022, and polls suggested there was a genuine chance Fan's independent campaign, without so much as a single party offering him institutional support, could win a majority of the popular vote and/or provinces. Some people in the liberal-led alliance tried to persuade Ma to drop out in favor of Fan, but Ma steadfastly insisted he could win a majority. All the parties in the Liberal Alliance officially stayed in line behind Ma, but most of them quietly signaled that they would be open to supporting the agenda of a Fan Jianquan presidency. Then, as the election season heated up in the sticky late summer, Chinese general elections are in September ahead of Mid-Autumn Festival, the race was upended again by the vice presidential selections. Xi was, of course, keeping Bo Xilai on. Ma wanted to do something that would draw attention away from Fan and back to him, select the first non-Han Chinese candidate on a national ticket. Eschewing the usual convention that a presidential candidate selects a running mate from the largest party in their alliance that isn't theirs, so since Ma wasn't a liberal, he'd be expected to select a liberal, he instead selected Rabia Kadir, the ethnically Uyghur holder of the North Dzungaria constituency seat in the NPC, and the longtime leader of the party Minority List. This was met with both praise and criticism from the usual suspects. Minority List, which is a party for the percent of Chinese population that isn't Han Chinese, has been an important part of the liberal coalition since the dawn of democracy, but Kadir especially drew scrutiny because of her past support for Xinjiang independence. Xi Jinping and Bo Xilai loudly tried to label her an Islamic extremist and an anti-Chinese racist. It's not clear how or if choosing Kadir changed Ma's polls at all, because a few days later, Fan pretty much said, "You want a minority on a national ticket? Hold my baijiu," and picked out a far more out there diversity hire, Veep. A Guangzhou City Council member, the Nigerian-born Godfrey Luchango, believed to be the only black elected official in all of East Asia. After China transitioned to democracy and their economy began going through the roof, they began to receive a trickle of immigration from developing countries, although they're almost definitely never going to be a nation of immigrants like the US. It's very difficult to immigrate to China, and in the 2022 election, both Ma and Fan endorsed expanding immigration as a solution to China's aging population, and we're beginning to see the dawn of Western-style anti-immigrant demagoguery in China, with Xi adopting "vote for the only Chinese candidates" as one of his slogans. One of the biggest immigrant communities in China at the moment is the ever-growing cluster of sub-Saharan African immigrants in the province of Guangdong. Today, there are estimated to be 500,000 Africans in Guangzhou. Their mouthpiece in national politics has long been Godfrey Luchango, who first got elected to the Guangzhou City Council in 2011 and had previously made a bid for governor of Guangdong in 2019 as a member of the province's majority-ruling Cantonese Party, which didn't get much traction. He was eliminated on the first ballot at the provincial party convention, but the prospect of a black immigrant governor in China got national and worldwide attention. When Fan Jianquan nominated Godfrey Luchango as his running mate, this made a lot of people mad and is widely regarded as a bad move. People weren't necessarily openly racist to him, although there was some of that. It was more like people were just baffled. Most Chinese people had never seen a black person except on TV. It was basically seen as a weird publicity stunt, like if Fan had nominated his mom or his car or something as vice president. At the vice presidential debates, both Bo and, somewhat more surprisingly, Kadir treated Luchango as more of a curiosity than anything else. The most common response to Fan's choice seemed to be just, why? Fan had been polling at around 55-60% before this and rapidly dropped to around 40% after he added Luchango to his ticket. It seemed China really wasn't ready for someone so foreign-seeming on a national ticket. What the polls predicted for the last few weeks into Election Day was that Fan would win a plurality of the popular vote, but a majority of provinces. which would make Fan president, according to the 2012 Supreme Court decision that had originally robbed Fan of the chance of being president. Because Fan still resented the Supreme Court for this decision, he declined to say whether he would accept being president if he won on provinces alone, and the media assumed all along there was a chance that Fan would decline the presidency if he didn't win over 50% of the popular vote. Ultimately, possibly due to a Chinese Bradley effect, and possibly because the uncertainty of whether he'd consider his mandate good enough was a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, Fan slightly underperformed his polls, winning pluralities but not majorities of both the popular vote and the provinces. Xi was the first incumbent Chinese president to come in not second but third place, even though he flipped one province he hadn't won in 2012 or 17, Inner Mongolia, once one of the safest provinces for the Liberal Alliance, now voted communist both because of vote splitting and the fact that Inner Mongolia's main industries are coal and steel making, and Fan and Ma both had stronger environmental planks in their platform than Xi did. Either way, nobody had a majority, so the outcome was not in doubt. It was time to open up the secret list. The number one position on the secret list was basketball star Yao Ming, so Yao Ming got to be president. The results in the NPC were far more of a mess, since Fan Jianchuan's supporters organized a party for him called the Fan Jianchuan List, which Fan himself wasn't even initially a member of, and while the list didn't do nearly as well as Fan himself, a lot of Fan supporters split their tickets for Fan for president and a Liberal Alliance party for NPC. They did take vote share from almost all the existing parties, and finished with a 21.8% plurality. Going off parties rather than alliances, it was the first election in Chinese history where the communists weren't the largest individual party in the NPC. In an unusually chaotic transition period after an unusually chaotic election, a coalition agreement was worked out, which usually happens before the election in China. Fan Jianchuan List agreed to join the Liberal Alliance if Fan himself could be the speaker of the NPC. Yao Ming had to pick a vice president, and constitutionally it couldn't be one of the candidates who had just run for president. And Fan couldn't be speaker since he had run for president, not the NPC. So Yao picked Zhao Haoyu, one of Fan's former compatriots on the Yibin City Council, who had won the central Yibin NPC constituency seat for the Fan Jianchuan List. Then, since Zhao Haoyu had vacated his NPC seat, there was a special election in which Fan ran for his hometown seat, won of course, and now he's speaker and Yao is president. Yao Ming is certainly not an idiot, does a reasonably good job carrying out the ceremonial duties of the presidency, and he's reasonably popular, largely because most Chinese understand he's just a fun figurehead and isn't really in charge. Fan Jianchuan himself currently has the lowest approval ratings he's ever had in his political career, as it becomes clearer that China's current problems go deeper than just one party. One thing all parties agreed on as of the 2022 election, and have been working on and off on a constitutional reform to make this happen, is that the secret list system has to go. Not a lot of people really want the secret list to be abolished altogether, since it really is an effective way of forcing the many parties to form alliances and build coalitions with each other. If there was no secret list system, it's conceivable there would be no alliances. Every party would run its own presidential candidate, and the president of China would be elected with just 20% or less of the popular vote. One proposal that most parties are on board with is a constitutional amendment lowering the threshold for breaking out the secret list to 40%. That is, you can win like 45% of the popular vote and be president. You have to get a plurality of less than 40% for the election to instead go to the secret list. But nobody seems to know if that'll be referred to the voters anytime soon, which is how constitutional amendments get passed in China, and because Yao, who got to the presidency through the secret list, is more popular than Fan, who didn't, it's not certain if that amendment will clear the 60% of the national electorate it needs to pass. But it's also possible the system will stay, but the way it's practiced will evolve. We could end up with a system where, in practice, the president of China is always a powerless figurehead non-politician celebrity, and the real power is in the hands of the speaker of the NPC from here on out. A de jure presidential system becomes a de facto parliamentary system. It would be like the relationship between the Canadian Prime Minister and the Governor General. If you're not Canadian and don't watch J.J. McCulloch, you probably have no idea what a Governor General even is. China's honeymoon is over, and their speedrun launch into the rich and democratic world is decidedly over. Who knows what the next Chinese election in 2027 will look like? What I can tell you about are the parties. Here are the 19 parties currently represented in the NPC, which is more parties than they've ever had at once. Let's start with the Communist-run alliance, which is the main opposition bloc now. The Chinese Communist Party is still China's natural governing party, and one of the few examples in the world of a party that used to rule a country as a one-party dictatorship, successfully transitioning to being a major party in a multi-party democracy. They're still referred to casually as the party, sort of analogous to the US Republicans being called the GOP. Chinese newspapers will refer to the party as shorthand for the CCP all the time. They may still be a party, but one thing they're not anymore is really communist. Again, I don't like trying to apply the Western left-right distinction to Chinese politics because it often just doesn't apply. But if anything, you could almost call the modern CCP right-wing populist. To some extent, they believe in keeping social programs in place, keeping the retirement age low, keeping a handful of workers' rights protections that some of the liberal alliance parties don't support, but not a wholesale reorganizing of society. Nobody believes they're straight-up anti-capitalist anymore, even though they do still say that. On social issues, the CCP and other parties in its coalition are reliably right-wing. They're all about Chinese nationalism, sometimes tipping into outright Chinese supremacism. They used to talk about uniting the whole Chinese-speaking world after China democratized. When Taiwan narrowly voted against becoming part of mainland China in 1996, the CCP suggested invading Taiwan, but nobody took that seriously, and now Taiwan is basically China's Canada. The CCP is strongly anti-immigration, anti-LGBT, anti-feminist. You could kind of compare the modern CCP to one of those European culture war right-wing parties that are also super into preserving the social safety net to please their elderly base of supporters. The Communists' traditional strongest provinces are the north-central ones like Shaanxi and Shaanxi, Jiangxi down in the southeast, where the CCP arguably first gained power back in the 1930s, and the far northeast. It was a big deal when Fan Jianchuan won Heilongjiang in the 2022 election because that's always been considered one of the CCP's big strongholds. Then there's the True Left, which was founded as a split-off from the CCP in 2001 and has been the Communists' main coalition partner ever since 2007. They're far more openly Mao did nothing wrong. They reject the more neoliberal social democratic turn the CCP has taken post-Deng Xiaoping and support raising taxes on the rich, nationalizing and collectivizing industry, and putting corrupt businessmen in jail. The True Left is totally simpatico with most of the CCP's right-wing culture war stuff, although they do have a gender equality plank in their platform. Some local True Left party committees are required to be led by one woman and one man at all times. They like quoting the Mao line that women hold up half the sky. They've never formed a majority on the provincial level without the help of the CCP, although in a few cases, like in Chongqing under the leadership of Bo Xilai before he became vice president, the True Left was the larger partner in a True Left CCP coalition. The so-called Chongqing model that Bo pioneered was pretty popular and led to the True Left remaining the dominant party in the province-sized quote-unquote city of Chongqing, all the way until the municipal elections of 2021, when it was swept out of power by the Social Democrats. And while there was more state control of business during the Chongqing model days, as well as extraordinary anti-corruption show trials that took on a cultural revolution vibe, the True Left kept on courting foreign investment. Seems that nobody in China really wants the Mao years back. The other party that often joins provincial coalitions with the CCP and has been part of its federal coalition since the very beginning is the Rural People's Party, which is exactly what it says on the tin. They're mostly a party for farmers' interests, which means that they're more unapologetically pro-free trade than either the CCP or the True Left, but they agree with almost all the rest of the CCP's racism and a social safety net type agenda. They're pro-environmental in some dimensions and anti-environmental in others, while the CCP and the True Left are pretty straightforwardly anti-environmental. Bo Xilai is rumored to be a climate change denier. Despite their name, the Rural People's Party also contests seats in urban areas, because they've also become something of a de facto party for old people's interests. The whole communist-led coalition tends to see retirees as their base, and there was a dedicated elderly people's party in the communist-led coalition from 2005 to 2019, when it merged with the Rural People's Party. Mostly just because those are people who have similar beliefs. They're culturally conservative and worried about the pace of change, but they also want the government to care for them. China First is another member of the communist-led coalition. They used to be called Reunification Now, and they were formed after the aforementioned Taiwan referendum in 1996 to encourage the CCP to invade Taiwan. Which, in the original draft of this script, I was like, can you believe that? That's like if America had a minor party that was all about invading Canada. Now we have a major party that's all about invading Canada. Anyway, reunification now began to realize that there's no appetite for doing something so rash for such little reward, and in 2011 they rebranded as a general, jingoistic, Han supremacist nationalist party. I don't like using the word fascist, but that may be the best way to describe China first. They believe in Chinese racial homogeneity and glorify military strength in a tightly organized society that functions like a well-oiled machine. That sounds like textbook fascism. Other than as a minor partner in communist-led coalitions, they aren't in power anywhere in China. The minor parties are gonna keep getting weirder from here. In 2022, we notably saw the first inclusion of 10,000 years in a major coalition. Of the fringe parties, 10,000 years might be the most fringe. They are neo-monarchists who think China has just consistently been going downhill since they got rid of the Mandate of Heaven, and what we really need to fix our modern problems is an all-powerful emperor. They want to return not to the Qing dynasty, the last Chinese imperial dynasty, but to the Ming dynasty, which was toppled in 1644 because the Qing were Manchu and therefore not Chinese enough. 10,000 years have been kind of a joke in Chinese politics ever since the dawn of democracy. America has flat earthers, China has these guys. Even before they were part of a major coalition, though, 10,000 years did actually win seats in the NPC a few times, since they ran their own presidential candidate in 2002, 2007, and 2012. See, in order to have any seats at all in the NPC, you need to do two things. You need to get over 0.5% of the national popular vote, that's the threshold, and you have to run or at least endorse a presidential candidate. That's why you'll never see a party with under 25 seats in the NPC. 25 is the minimum, since the NPC operates on proportional representation, and you need to get at least 0.5% total nationwide, which entitles you to 25 of the 5,000 seats in the NPC. And that's why they had to add the secret list rule, because otherwise every single little party would run its own presidential candidate, and nobody would win more than 20% of the vote. A few of the fringe parties have run their own presidential candidates, though, since they don't actually care whether the election goes to the secret list and they just want the right to have some members in the NPC. 10,000 Years is the party that has done this the most consistently. Each of their presidential runs was someone they knew wouldn't win and wasn't even a prominent member of the party, just someone they picked up at a party meeting. Meanwhile, their leader, a guy named Zhu Changzhang, who claims to be, and is, a direct descendant of the Ming dynasty, but that's not as impressive as it sounds because they lived hundreds of years ago and had hundreds of concubines, so by now they have millions of descendants. Anyway, during the periods that 10,000 Years has had seats in the NPC, never being part of any coalition until now, Zhu Changzhang has been their leader. 10,000 Years didn't have any NPC seats from 2017 to 22, since they chose not to run a presidential candidate in 2017. They never said why, but it was speculated that given Xi Jinping's strong Chinese nationalism, Zhu Changzhang really wanted Xi to get re-elected and wanted to avoid running a sacrificial candidate who would run the risk of sending the election to the secret list. This was denied by most members of the party at the time. Of course they don't support the communists. They're monarchists. But during the alliance-forming period ahead of the 2022 election, sure enough, Xi offered Zhu the option of joining the communist coalition, and he accepted. This was a big deal, and it didn't work out great for the communists. Xi's polls were already pretty bad because of his heavy-handed COVID response, and associating with a very fringe party seen by most Chinese as crazy arguably damaged his brand even more. But it worked out well for 10,000 years. They now have 60 seats in the NPC, which isn't a lot in a legislature with 5,000 members, but it's a major high watermark for the neo-monarchists. They even won a single constituency seat. Pretty rare for a party that small. Usually the small parties only have party list seats, and the constituency seats are won by the bigger parties. Appropriately, the single-member constituency they represent is the seat representing the old city of Xi'an. Partnering with the Communist Alliance has clearly got 10,000 Years a sense of legitimacy with some of the public, perhaps a mandate, one that comes from a higher sense of authority. I swear there used to be a name for that kind of thing. Help me out here. On the opposite side of the spectrum, actually still authoritarian, but a completely different kind of authoritarian, is the other new kid on the Commie Alliance block, a fully newly created party called End Crime, End Corruption. At least that's how it gets translated, and I'm not sure I can come up with a better translation. EC2, sure, I'll abbreviate them that way, is like an unapologetically techno-authoritarian party. They were founded while the 2022 alliance forming period was already underway by former members of the Technocratic Party, another minor party that was part of the Communist coalition during Xi's 2 terms until they jumped to the Liberal-led coalition during the alliance forming period. Some technocrats didn't agree with that decision and formed a new party, more focused on one minor part of the technocrats' 2017 official party platform that the party leader Ding Lei struck from the platform ahead of the 22 election. That they wanted to stop crime by setting up something called a social credit system, where universal surveillance guided by AI facial recognition would score the pro-social behavior of every single citizen on a scale of 0 to 1,000 and dole out financial rewards and criminal penalties for high and low scores. Every other party was like, that's incredibly dystopian, and it was a bit of a black mark on the technocrats' reputation. They didn't do as well in 2017 as they had in the past and continued to slide in 2022, even after they repudiated their past support for a social credit system and moved to the liberal-led coalition. EC2, meanwhile, was like, what are you guys talking about? This is a good idea, and tried to sell China on it. They didn't really succeed at doing that, but they did succeed at convincing the communists, who let EC2 into their coalition. The whole CCP alliance in the 22 election was just a nightmare blunt rotation. Pick your party. The natural governing party that has no consistent ideology but winning and doesn't currently seem to be successful at even that. Sure, okay, that's a type of party in lots of countries. Chill, agrarian, center-right party for old people. Alright, fine. Then we've got Maoist supervillains, Chinese Nazi supervillains, Divine Right of Kings supervillains, cyberpunk dystopia supervillains. It's just the league of villains. No unifying ideology, but evil. I'm being too harsh on these parties. Like, we have crazy parties in the West, too. If all the separate factions on the American right had their own parties, it would look like this, too, and their coalition won the most recent election, while the equivalent in China lost in a landslide. Not so high and mighty now, am I? It's just funny to me that, specifically in the 2022 election, all the craziest parties happened for the first time to coalesce onto the same side. Anyway, EC2 narrowly cleared the 0.5% barrier to get into the NPC and shocked even themselves by winning a single constituency seat in a dull little town in Shandong called Rongcheng. You know those cringy-ass bumper stickers that say 1984 wasn't supposed to be an instruction manual? End Crime, End Corruption seems to see 1984 as an instruction manual. So, that's the communist-led coalition, as it was in the 2022 election. They got a combined 32.6% of the vote share in the NPC, which was at least slightly better than the 28.8% that Xi and Bo managed in the presidential election. There were presumably a few million people who voted for one of these parties, but voted Fan Jianchuan for president. Behold, the median voter! I do wonder what the future holds for any of these parties. People have speculated about a merger between China First and 10,000 Years, forming a real ultra-far-right party for China that could be alarmingly successful, but given the landslide loss of this coalition, by far the worst the communists have ever done, it's also possible the CCP will purge all the little fringe parties out of their coalition once the 2027 alliance forming period is looming, or sooner, if the Fan Jianchuan and the Liberals coalition collapses, and the NPC has to hack out a new coalition midway through Yao Ming's presidential term, which is a legit possibility. Speaking of, here's the current ruling coalition. It has 13 parties, which is by far the most multi-partisan coalition China has ever seen, and possibly any country ever. I looked up examples of other coalitions with a crazy number of parties. I suspected that the Netherlands, India, or Israel might have had a coalition with more parties, but the Netherlands, despite famously having hella parties in parliament, has never needed more than 5 of them to form a coalition at once. The everyone but Netanyahu coalition that briefly ruled Israel a few years ago just had 8 parties. India, the only country with as many people as China, and while this isn't a hard and fast rule, it does seem like in the case of India and China, mo people, mo parties. In India's most recent election, the historic governing party, Congress, which has since been reduced to a very distant second by the dominance of the BJP, they led a coalition of 37 parties, but they didn't win, so that doesn't count. I did manage to find one state-level governing alliance in India that equaled but not surpassed China's current arrangement. The Kerala Legislative Assembly in the south of India is led by a coalition of 13 parties. I'll break kayfabe for a second and say, this part is real. Look at this. In this video, I'm trying to create a deliberately complicated and confusing political system that nonetheless feels real, but on that front, nothing can surpass real-life Indian politics. Let me know if there are coalitions that have more. I didn't check every legislature in India. Anyway, so the main party in the Liberal-led alliance is not actually the Liberals for the first time in the history of China's democracy. People still call it the Liberal Alliance, but the biggest party, the one that's clearly calling the shots, is the Fan Jianquan list. They're basically a populist, kinda left libertarian party, I guess. Fan has a saying that he's right of the capitalists and left of the true left. On social issues, they are pretty left-wing. They promoted a national constitutional referendum that legalized gay marriage, just narrowly clearing the 60% it needed to pass. They've tried to legalize weed, which again, Fan already did on the provincial level in Sichuan, but doesn't command majority support nationwide, so even though they wouldn't need a constitutional referendum to pass it and would just need a majority vote in the NPC, I don't think that's going to come up to a vote anytime soon. The Fan Jianquan list also combines their social progressivism with an almost Doge-like interest in slashing bureaucracy. Like, these days Elon Musk is trying to paint China as a woke dystopia and Fan as a far-left dictator akin to Mao, but I can't imagine his mass firings of federal workers weren't inspired by Fan's mass firings of federal workers that he carried out as soon as the coalition was worked out in 2022. Fan was a little bit more successful than Doge. It seemed like in the previous Xi Jinping administration there really was bloat, and there really were bureaucrats doing basically nothing. Fan's coalition has ordered audits of all the major government agencies and tried to cut all the spending they can, which they've done far more carefully and judiciously than Elon has. Fiscal conservatism is not really a thing in China. There are parties that are economically right-wing, of course, in the sense of wanting lower taxes and freer markets and the privatization of some services, but until recently, no party, not even the capitalists who are super libertarian, really thought government spending was excessive. Probably because, until recently, China's economy was running so hot that they really could afford almost anything. The Fan Jianquan list may be the first party to say, what if there's too much spending? What if we should keep an eye on our debt? See why I compared Fan to Ross Perot? I think that's a pretty good comparison. If the communists are China's traditional natural governing party, the other natural governing party are the liberals. They did worse in 2022 than they've ever done, finishing with over 11% of the vote in the NPC, but the governing coalition is still usually referred to as the liberal-led coalition, even though most of the liberal voters jumped to Fan Jianquan. They are, well, they're liberals. They're pretty akin to the US Democrats. Free markets, free trade, free people. They support LGBT rights, affirmative action for minorities, and neither expanding nor cutting the social safety net. Back in the day, that was all you needed to win an election in China. In China's first election in 1992, their presidential candidate won 63% of the national popular vote. He only needed the support of one other party, the Social Democrats, to have a majority in the NPC. They've consistently slid in every election since then, as more and more smaller, more narrowly focused parties have sprung up, and the liberals have increasingly found it hard to justify why they're needed. In the past, all of their ideas were new and fresh in China. Now they're the establishment, and nobody likes the establishment. In addition to the Fan Jianquan list, one other party the liberals have bled support to are the capitalists, who are also one of the founding parties in the first Chinese election and are pretty doctrinaire libertarians who love privatization and laissez-faire capitalism. They were basically founded on doing the opposite of whatever the communists supported, and they've stuck to that. They're the only party that's openly endorsed raising the retirement age and cutting the social safety net. At the same time, though, these days they talk at least as much about trans rights as any American progressive. In fact, Jack Ma wants to forcibly trans your children is one of the most widely used lines of attack by Xi against Ma's alliance in the 2022 election, and while Fan Jianquan flipped both a lot of previously communist constituencies and previously liberal constituencies, exit polls suggest Ma, the first member of the Capitalist Party to be a national presidential nominee, won the LGBT vote by a huge margin. The capitalists are most popular in the southeast, where they've been the leader of the governing coalition in Ma's home province of Zhejiang for the past 15 years. The Hakka ethnic minority also strongly supports the capitalists. Most of the constituency seats they've won are in Hakka-heavy areas in the south. The capitalists want to make trade deals with everyone, sell off the high-speed rail lines to private investors, and abandon Xi's jingoistic claims to the South China Sea, which puts them at odds with Fan Jianquan, who wants to continue the saber-rattling that Xi and the communists started. China largely abandoned its ambition to quote-unquote reunify Taiwan, but Claiming the whole South China Sea with their 9-dash line is actually surprisingly popular with the Chinese public, and unilateral disengagement from the South China Sea dispute is seen as an unpopular elite position. It hurts China's relations with their neighbors, though, which is probably why the capitalists are one of the loudest voices in favor of pulling back. How are you going to sell stuff to Vietnam and the Philippines if you're claiming to own their islands? Currently the fourth largest party in the Fan-Jianchuan Liberal Alliance, and traditionally the second largest party in the Liberal Alliance, are the Social Democrats. Despite having the socialist rose in their logo, they are not explicitly anti-capitalist, and, well, they're Social Democrats. Other than emphasizing workers' rights, there's not a lot of daylight between them and the Liberals, and ever since the very first coalition forming period, there have been suggestions that the Libs and the Socidems should merge. They almost already have. On the provincial level in several places, they've merged into a single party called the Liberal Democrats. The city of Shanghai is currently governed by a party called the Shanghai Democrats, which are the same thing. And on the federal level, the Libs and the Socidems don't run candidates against each other in single-member constituencies. There's one place where they do run against each other, though. In Heilongjiang in the far north, the provincial-level Socialdem party is actually ideologically more like the true left and partners with the communists against a liberal and minority list-dominated alliance. But I don't have time to get into the granularities of Heilongjiang politics that led to that. The Liberals are dominant in big cities and some of the north-central provinces. The Socidems do better in the mountainous southwest, where they often enter into alliances with minority lists. That's basically their biggest difference. Two regional variants. Now we're getting into the parties that are explicitly meant to represent one particular group's interests. The Dialects Party is meant to represent anyone who doesn't speak Mandarin, and understandably they're strongest in the southeast, where people speak languages that aren't remotely close to Mandarin. They're often a partner with the capitalists, who are also strong with ethnic and linguistic minorities in the southeast. Their biggest issue is basically insisting that Han Chinese people who don't speak Mandarin are the most oppressed people in the world, and the solution is to not require students to learn Mandarin and fund TV and radio stations in regional dialects. Other than that, they basically have a banal center-left platform along similar lines to the Liberals. In Guangdong, their provincial-level equivalent party are called Guanghua, usually translated as the Cantonese Party, but because of the contraction of the word for Cantonese they use, it can also be read as broad voice, sort of with connotations of like a big tent, a united front. Other than the far outlying provinces like Tibet and Xinjiang that are dominated by the minority list, no province is more dominated by one party than Guanghua dominates Guangdong. They're the only high-population province where a single party holds the majority in the legislature without needing any coalition partners, and they've been that way for over a quarter century now. They've even been described as having a soft dictatorship in Guangdong. Chen Yang, who has been the governor of Guangdong since 1999, is the longest-serving provincial governor in China and has blocked attempts at instituting term limits and challenges to his leadership, including, notably, from Godfrey Luchengo in 2019, although Luchengo subsequently mended fences with Chen and became one of his most vocal supporters, to the point that some people claim it was Chen Yang who spearheaded Fan's choice of Luchengo for his running mate. Rabia Kadir, at the second vice presidential debate, notably claimed that Luchengo was a puppet of Chen Yang's Guangdong nationalist regime. Either way, Chen, who is still genuinely very popular in Guangdong, was one of Fan Jianchuan's most ardent supporters in 2022, and his support is credited with making Guangdong Fan's second strongest province after his native Sichuan, even though the National Dialects Party stuck with Ma in the liberal capitalist Socialdem alliance. Another member of that alliance, at least on the federal level, are the Greens. The Greens are interesting. They're a green party, and they're represented by this silhouette of a deer, because that's a pun on the word for green. Most green parties the world over can be placed on a spectrum from, like, Matt Iglesias to Ted Kaczynski. You got parties that are center-left social democrats who like solar power, and you got parties that explicitly support degrowth and think that industrial civilization was a mistake, and everything in between those extremes. The Chinese Green Party is surprisingly close to the Ted Kaczynski end, especially in the past when they were much stronger than they are now. They're arguably the most successful degrowth party in the world. They initially formed in the mid-90s, mostly to protest the construction of the Three Gorges Dam, and became so popular that in the 1997 provincial election in Hubei, the province where the dam was being built, They leapt from nothing to a majority in the legislature, although there was enough ticket splitting that a communist won the governorship, and the Greens weren't able to stop the construction of the dam. They branched out from stopping the dam to generally stopping China's rapid development in the 2000s. They were strongly against high-speed rail from the very start, against those dour high-rise housing blocks most Chinese people live in these days, against the factories and the opening up to the world. Nick Kristof wrote in the New York Times in 2005, near the peak of the Greens' popularity, that the Greens were China's, quote, one true conservative party. To be fair, China was changing incredibly fast and becoming much more polluted and much more of a dour, alienating, man-made landscape, and both the Communist Alliance and the Liberal Alliance supported it all. There was demand for a party like this. They were the one party that was truly anti-establishment. And in the 2000s, the Greens drew support from up to a third of China in some polls. As a result, in the alliance-forming period ahead of the 2002 election, the Communists and the Liberals formed what in other countries would be called a grand coalition. A coalition where the two biggest parties that are usually rivals team up to block a more extreme party from getting into power. In China, this election was appropriately referred to as the United Front. The election saw Jiang Qinghong, a shrewd moderate communist with alliance support from basically all the parties that weren't the Greens, defeat Green candidate Dai Qing, the leader of the Greens in the NPC, with 68% of the popular vote. Still the largest winning margin for any presidential candidate in China, but Dai's 30% was also a major high watermark for the Greens. In the NPC, the United Front coalition was shaky, and in a case of history rhyming, the Liberals initially quit the alliance in 2004, which led to an 8-month period where there was no majority coalition in the NPC, followed by the Communists coming out on top by hacking together a new coalition which didn't include the Liberals or Greens, with defections to them from most of the other major parties. For the 2007 election, the Liberals bit the bullet and invited the Greens into their alliance, preferring that over the chaos of another united front. The Greens have slid ever since, largely because their cause is all pretty much lost. The dam got built, the high-speed rail got built, China kept getting more polluted but also richer at the same time, and then in just the past few years, other parties began to make real progress on air and water pollution. When I was in Beijing a couple years ago, everyone talked about how the smog used to be so much worse. You'd think the Greens would be able to make a comeback with the salience of climate change, but other parties have positioned themselves as the ones who are taking on climate change, like the Soc Dems and the Youth Party, while the Greens continue to emphasize degrowth-tinged issues like bringing back the one-child policy, which was abolished in 2018 with the support of all the parties in the NPC except the Greens. The Greens are also weirdly tough on crime. Other than environmental issues, that's the other issue they talk about the most. The use of the death penalty has been declining ever since China's transition to democracy, and while capital punishment is still generally pretty popular and is unlikely to be fully abolished anytime soon, one of the only parties that talks a lot about how we need to expand the use of the death penalty back to how it was in the pre-democratic days are, oddly enough, the Greens. They've also supported some aspects of the technocrats' plan for a national surveillance system. They are not unique in this sense. Mexico also has a Green Party whose main other issue besides being environmentally friendly is being tough on crime. I don't know enough about Mexican politics to explain how that works there, but let me see if I can explain how it works in China. This is just my read on the situation, but I feel like it's because the Chinese Greens have a fundamentally dim view of humanity. They think that humans are inherently destructive to the environment and to each other, and we need strong laws to protect us from humanity's cruel true nature. So maybe Ted Kaczynski wasn't the best comparison. They're not anarcho-primitivists, they're more like eco-Hobbesians. Also, before Yao Ming became president, the Greens had the closest thing China has to a celebrity politician. Since the 2017 election, their leader has been Liu Cixin, the legendary sci-fi author who's most famous for the Three-Body Problem series. Again, they don't have much influence anymore, and their main condition for remaining part of the Liberal coalition was for the coalition to scrap their further plans for expanding the high-speed rail system and abandon plans to require a higher standard of evidence to use the death penalty in murder cases, both of which they only partially did. There's the Women's Party, which is a feminist party, but a moderate one. They're like Hillary Clinton, gaslight gatekeep girl boss, more women CEOs feminism. They want gender quotas in government and on corporate boards, free tampons, universal childcare, and on non-gender related issues, laissez-faire capitalism. Some of them are TERFs, some of them are trans-inclusive. There were rumors ahead of the 2022 election that they'd split into two parties over the trans issue, but ultimately their 2022 election platform didn't mention trans issues at all, and they even ran a few trans candidates for the NPC, albeit in constituencies where they had no chance of winning. They're most popular in big cities, especially neighborhoods with college campuses, and they've never been more than a minor partner in liberal coalitions. The minority list is a party whose power and influence belies their size. They've never gotten more than 4% of the national popular vote, but because they run up Assad numbers in low population provinces with ethnic minority voters in the far west and far north, and you need a majority of provinces regardless of population to win the presidency, there's something of a kingmaker in the Liberal coalition. A presidential candidate isn't going to get the Liberal Alliance nomination without minority list support. They have a different constituency than the Dialects Party. Dialects voters are typically Han Chinese people who speak languages that fall under the umbrella of Chinese but not Mandarin. Minority list voters are non-Han people who speak languages like Tibetan, Uyghur, Mongolian, or Manchu. The minority list has majority governments in Tibet, Xinjiang, Ningxia, and Inner Mongolia, but those provinces are so low population compared to the rest of China that in total, they comprise a minority of the minority list's support, and most of their voters live in the southwestern provinces that are still Han majority but have substantial populations of the Yao and Hmong, who are called Miao in China. Most of the minority list's leaders have come from Tibet or Xinjiang because it's easier to rise through the ranks in a low population province where the minority list is so dominant that they're basically synonymous with government. In provinces like Guangxi and Yunnan, minority list is a junior partner who typically form coalitions with the Soc Dems and Dialects. Other than affirmative action and other minority rights issues, one of the minority list's main issues, interestingly, is that they're pretty anti-environmental. This is just a quirk of how their leaders mostly come from places that happen to be China's main oil drilling and coal mining provinces. Then there's the Youth Party. They're the closest thing there is to like a Western social media social justice progressive party. Because of the historic way right and left are thought of, most parties in China that are pro-LGBT and feminist and pro-minority rights and stuff are also super pro-business, and they're so scarred by Mao that not a lot of parties are economically left-wing at all. Like, the true left is, but they're super socially conservative and their voter base is mostly old people. The Youth Party officially calls itself just a party for young people's interests, whatever those might be, rather than placing itself anywhere on a political spectrum, but in practice they're one of the only parties that is both pro-LGBT and anti-capitalist. They're pretty clearly like the closest thing China has to American campus leftists. And that's pretty clearly their base too, college students. The Youth Party currently has one constituency seat in the Haidian district of Beijing, which is not coincidentally where the campuses of a bunch of China's top universities are. Their big issues are mostly the same issues that animate progressive parties in America and Europe. LGBT rights, especially trans rights, minimum wage hikes, tenants' rights for renters, being pro-immigration and making a big fuss about how racist the country they live in is, climate change, but not necessarily the more anti-development issues that the Greens emphasize. Like, they're very pro-vaccine against the Greens. I forgot to mention that the Greens are pretty anti-vax. And they're definitely against the Greens' tough on crime plank, and they're one of the most strongly pro-Palestine parties. Most Chinese people are pro-Palestine, but it's also not really considered a serious issue. Like, there haven't been major pro-Palestine marches in any Chinese cities that I know of, at least. And interestingly, the Youth Party and the True Left are the two parties that have really emphasized Palestine as one of their main issues. Most other parties either don't have an official position or have some line in their platform about how they should defend Palestine, but don't say or do much about it. The only party represented in the NPC that's explicitly pro-Israel is the Hong Kong Independence Party, oddly enough, which makes sense if you think about it. Even though they're another one of the only parties that is both socially and economically progressive and have sometimes been rated as the most left-wing party in the legislature, they're also obviously super pro-Western. And when people claim that Israel is a colonial project, they can rightfully be like, well, colonialism was good for us. But anyway, back to the Youth Party. If there's one issue where they really diverge from the leftist groups in the West that they resemble, it's the strain of, like, technophilia, I guess that's the word, that the Chinese Youth Party has. Like, they've condemned Elon Musk a lot as a person, but they still have a plank in their platform about building hyperloops between China's major cities, and they talk a lot about space. Like, you go to a Chinese Youth Party meeting, you're gonna hear about housing affordability, you're gonna hear about Palestine, you're gonna hear about climate change, and then you're gonna hear a ton about space. Almost every party has an official position on space where they're like, yeah, wouldn't it be nice if China shot off more rockets? Wouldn't it be nice if we tried to land on Mars or something? But the Youth Party has by far the most detailed and most front and center space exploration platform, eclipsing even the technocrats. In the 2022 election, they talked about building a space elevator on an artificial island in the South China Sea, and building a Chinese colony in a particular crater on the moon. And the thing that's landed the Youth Party in the news at least a little bit outside China lately is that they're super pro-AI. Like, for the past couple of years, that's arguably been their main issue. They've long had this anti-copyright, anti-patent plank in their platform, so I guess they're kind of reminiscent of the 2000s European pirate parties in that way. That's how I describe the Youth Party. The same sort of DSA, Greta Thunberg, blue sky leftist activism, clumsily welded to a sort of digital frontier 2000s Napster libertarianism that feels kind of dated these days in the West. So now they see generative AI as a wrecking ball that they can use against their real enemy, copyright. The average young Chinese person sees AI as anti-capitalist, or at least that's the official position that the Youth Party holds to. They even unilaterally cut off their partnership with the Democratic Socialists of America over this. For a while, they had an official relationship with the DSA. They'd go do exchange programs where campus organizers from China would do some organizing in the US and vice versa. They did joint appearances at international summits and stuff. And when the DSA put out a statement mildly criticizing AI and AI art specifically about a year ago, the Chinese Youth Party pulled out of the partnership. They're really serious about this. In the US, it was misreported as the DSA cutting off ties with the Youth Party because they were too pro-AI, which seems like it makes more sense, but no. Being pro-AI is so important to the Youth Party, arguably China's most powerful progressive party, that they were willing to sever their relationship with their equivalent in the world's other great power over it. I haven't seen people try to explain this much, because in my experience, the Youth Party really doesn't understand why Western leftists would be anti-AI at all, and your average Xiaohongshu leftist seems to genuinely think Western leftists are being paid by big media companies to shill anti-AI positions for them. And your average blue sky leftist, if they know anything about the Chinese Youth Party, probably thinks they're being paid by big tech companies to shill pro-AI positions for them. And everyone accepts that that must be the answer and doesn't want to dig into why these two ultimately similar movements are so diametrically opposed on this one issue. But here's my attempt at explaining this. Both Chinese youth leftists and American youth leftists like futuristic technology in theory but not in practice. Once a technology is mainstream, they turn against it. And that means different technologies in China versus the West. In America, space settlement and AI get coded as things that billionaires are into and are trying to force down our throats. In China, not necessarily. Like the big Chinese AI that rocked the world a little while ago, DeepSeek, that was a side project. Chinese tech companies aren't necessarily that interested in AI, while Chinese consumers are. So in China, both space and AI are seen more like the way high-speed rail is seen in America. Americans think of high-speed rail as a futuristic pipe dream, and leftists are mostly pro-high-speed rail. In China, high-speed rail has been boring and ordinary for about 10 years, and leftists are often the ones most forcefully against further extensions to the high-speed rail system. Like in America, you'll see an article about how some tech tycoon is spending an eye-popping sum on an AI data center or a rocket launch site, and someone with a handle like perpetually tired, Adorno simp, skydiver emoji, and 12 mental illnesses in their bio will respond, "We literally just want healthcare and high-speed rail." Whereas in China, you'll see an article about the government building a high-speed rail line to bumfuck nowhere and how happy all the local businessmen are about it, and Chinese Zoomers will post it on Weibo like, "Why are we still building this shit when we could have a colony on the moon?" The grass is always greener on the other side of the grass mud horse pen. The Anti-Lockdown Party is a one-issue party formed during COVID. No prizes for guessing what their one issue is. Now that the lockdowns are over, they'll probably wither away. They got the most support in previously communist-ruled provinces, which had the strongest lockdowns. The Families Party has been around for a while and was originally part of the communist-led alliance, so they sparked some attention by jumping to the liberal-led alliance ahead of the 2022 election. They call themselves a family values party, which doesn't seem to be a euphemism for homophobia, for them. They were originally a one-issue party against the one-child policy, and when that was abolished with widespread support, they became more of a communitarian party that supports more investment in education and more of a social safety net specifically for parents. With increasing concern about China's declining population, they're trying to position themselves as China's main pro-natalist party, and they're pretty successful on that. They're up and coming. They got under 2% of the national popular vote in 2022, but right now, some polls show their support in the 2027 election approaching 10%. Who knows if they can hold on to that momentum? Now, I've talked about the Technocratic Party a bit before. They've been around a while too. They also used to be part of the communist-led Big Tent until 2022. They were founded by a guy named Ding Lei, who founded the software company NetEase, and they're basically like the Capitalist Party with more emphasis on space settlement and transhumanism. Lately, their main messaging that they've settled on is that AI needs to take over the functions of government. Just a few weeks ago, there were municipal elections in Hangzhou, a city that's basically the Silicon Valley of China, and the Youth Party and the Technocrats agreed to back the same candidate for mayor, whose platform involved the complete automation of the Hangzhou city government, although it was a two-round election and that candidate didn't get to the second round. That candidate was originally from the Youth Party and is pretty left-wing on economics, even though she was backed by the Technocrats, showing that the Technocrats seem to emphasize being pro-technology over being pro-capitalism if those two things conflict. One notable member of the Technocratic Party is He Jiankui, the real-life mad scientist who spent a few years in jail for gene-editing human babies to make them immune to HIV. Even though he was in jail during the 2022 election, at the 2022 Liberal Party convention, the delegation from the Technocrats entered He's name into contention as their preferred presidential candidate. The Technocrats are kind of the Liberal Alliance's equivalent of 10,000 years. Most people in China just think they're weird. The smallest party in the Liberal coalition is the Hong Kong Independence Party, or HKIP, and maybe this is the real equivalent of 10,000 years. They're also a tiny party that has run their own presidential candidates before, has never been part of a major alliance until now, and it was a big deal that shocked the political establishment when they announced they had been invited into the Liberal coalition. People asked if the Liberal coalition was now officially endorsing Hong Kong independence. And no, they weren't necessarily, and the leader of HKIP, Bajio Long, reversed his previous independence at all costs stance once he was invited into the coalition, saying he preferred a more gradual process of autonomy from China. Still, it was an unpopular move on the mainland, welcoming them into the coalition, and probably cost Jack Ma's candidacy more votes on the mainland than it gained him from Hong Kong. The Hong Kong independence movement isn't quite as much a fight for survival as it would be if China was still the country it was back before 1989. Imagine that. But it commands support from about half of Hong Kongers at any given time, and in the 2022 election, the HKIP won every single member constituency in Hong Kong, largely as a protest vote against the repressive COVID restrictions. This is a long-ass video, and I'll break kayfabe to once again say, I was really trying to make a complicated and chaotic political system. A video explaining real-life Indian politics would probably be at least this long to be accurate, but I kind of feel responsible for how long this video ended up, because I could have chosen for there to be fewer parties, but I didn't. Thanks for sticking with me through to the end. Who would you vote for if you lived in this alternate China?